I've said repeatedly that the EOS R5, and for that matter its sibling the R6, is a complicated camera. The manual is just shy of 1,000 pages, and quite honestly, even at that length, it consistently falls short of being great. So I shouldn't need to say it, but over the course of making these videos, I've missed things. I've made some mistakes, and I've learned some new things too. What's up everybody, I'm Jason, and welcome back to another video in my series of tips and tricks for the Canon EOS R5. Unlike the previous 31 videos, the theme of this video is things I didn't get quite right, or missed completely for that matter, in one of those previous videos. And I suspect that this is only the first of these as this series continues. So to start off, I want to go back to tip 13 and talk about auto ISO. Specifically, I have 2 points and both are related to controlling the auto ISO with the dials on the camera. One of these is a bit of a hack, but it works, and the other is a setting I missed, though I doubt you'll blame me when you see what the manual says about it. So back in the comments for tip 13, Kevin Dietz brought up a way to deal with the inability to enter or exit auto ISO mode while the camera is metering. So to quickly recap the situation, while the camera is metering, the ISO mode is fixed in either auto or manual. So if you've manually selected an ISO, you can change it with the second quick control dial, but you can't switch the camera into auto until the metering stops. Scrolling all the way to the bottom will just stop it low, or ISO 100, depending on how your camera's set. Likewise, if you're in auto, you can temporarily override the calculated ISO, but you can't switch back into manual mode again until the meter stops. So in talking with Kevin, we realized that you could stop the meter at any time by pressing the mode button twice. It's a bit of a hack, but it works. On the first press, the camera stops metering and enters the mode selection screen, and on the second press, it goes back to shooting standby with the metering cleared. You can do the same thing with the menu and review buttons, but it's clunkier as it takes longer for the camera to switch into the menu or review modes and then switch back to shooting. What I failed to notice at the time was that the quick control menu button also has the same effect. Double pressing the quick control button will kick the camera out of metering and leave you ready to adjust the ISO with the second quick control dial. Of the choices, I think the quick control button is probably the easiest to use while shooting, since it's basically under your thumb or right near it. But for me, the mode button is easier to use when I've got the camera on a tripod. So in either case, it's probably worth being aware of the two options just in case you need them. So that's the workaround. Now for the omission. What I missed is that there's actually a custom function that impacts all of this, though again, I don't think you can blame me based on what the manual says about it. So over on the Custom Functions 1 menu page, you'll find a setting called Speed from Metering / ISO Auto, and it has two options, which are Restore Auto after metering and Retain Speed after metering. Now, if the title of the function doesn't tell you anything useful about it, then the description is even worse. I mean, this is what the manual says, and tell me if this makes any sense to you. Quote, you can set the ISO speed status after the metering timer ends in cases where for auto ISO operation in program, shutter priority, aperture priority, manual, and bulb mode, the camera has adjusted the ISO speed during the metering or during the metering timer. I mean, I can barely parse that into something intelligible. It feels to me like it went through Google Translate about 4 times. So what's actually happening with this setting? Well, what my camera does is not quite what the manual describes. When this setting is set to restore auto after metering, the default, what actually seems to happen in the camera is that it stays in auto at all the times, but lets you override the ISO when metering. So you get the behavior I described in my auto ISO video. Auto will be displayed under the ISO icon in white when the ISO speed is calculated by the camera, and it will turn gray when you override that calculated ISO with your own. When the metering ends, the camera will still be in auto, and it will say auto because, well, it never left auto. However, if you set this to retain speed after metering, if you override the calculated ISO in auto mode, the camera immediately turns auto ISO off completely and puts you back in manual ISO mode. So when the metering timer runs out, the ISO you set stays set just as it would if you were doing things manually. Watch the ISO indicator when I change the ISO this time. The small auto under the ISO icon didn't dim, it went away completely, and the camera now is in manual ISO at the selected ISO speed. That said, whether or not you want to use this function depends entirely on how you think about adjusting speeds in auto ISO. If the in the default mode, auto ISO stays in auto, so you can shoot, override it if you need to, and when you pick the camera up again, it will still be in auto. Changing into the second option means that if you override the auto-calculated value when you're shooting, you're back in manual mode, and you'll still be there at that ISO that you set the next time you pick up the camera to use it. Personally, I've decided I'm going to give this setting a shot for a while and see how I get along. The second thing I wanted to talk about is exposure simulation, something I omitted from tips 27 and 28 when I worked through the screen and viewfinder options. Now, on reflection, it should have been included, and it seems like a glaring omission to me now that I, didn't think about it. What amazes me is that the setting completely slipped my mind at all, since I frequently state how mirrorless cameras give you a what you see is what you get view for your images, and that's true, but only if exposure simulation is enabled. I was reminded of this setting when I was working on an upcoming video on the live histogram, and as much as I'd like to, I'm not going to spoil that one here. You'll just have to subscribe to see it when it's done. Exposure simulation is found on the Shoot 7 menu page and has three options: enable, during depth of field preview, and disable. When this is set to enable, you get a what you see is what you get view of the world. The live image matches the brightness of the exposure that you're going to have. If you're going to underexpose the scene, the image will be dark. If you're going to overexpose the scene, the image will be bright. When exposure simulation is enabled, previewing the depth of field still requires pushing the depth of field preview button. The second option is during depth of field preview. In this mode, the screen normally displays the live image at a standard brightness that's intended to make it easy to see. When you press the depth of field preview button, in addition to stopping down the lens, the camera will also adjust the image's exposure to reflect how the final image will appear. The final option is disabled. When exposure simulation is set to disabled, the camera always displays the image in that standard brightness level. This will be the case whether you adjust the exposure compensation, set a manual exposure, or preview the depth of field. Now, I probably don't have to say this, but my camera is set to enabled. To me, one of the greatest benefits of mirrorless camera is that it allows you to properly visualize what you're shooting before you shoot it. And a big part of that is having the exposure reflected in the live image in the viewfinder. So I hope these tips were helpful, and if they were, let me know by hitting that like button. If this kind of thing is your kind of thing, please consider subscribing if you're not already. Remember, you can't forget to unsubscribe later if you don't subscribe now. Finally, if you know someone else who might find this useful, spread the word and share it with them. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.